We're starting off personality, which is unit 10. So if you look at it in that perspective, we've got an awful lot of light at the end of the tunnel. You've only got unit 11. We cover units 12 and 13 together. And then it's unit 14, and we are officially finished with content. So you are almost done having to listen to me talk at you through these videos. Yay! First component of this unit that we're going to take a look at when trying to understand personality and see how people explain it, that's going to be from the psychoanalytic or the psychodynamic approach. Oftentimes you will hear these words used interchangeably because whether you are psychoanalytic like Freud or psychodynamic like Carl Jung, who we're going to talk about a little bit later, ultimately there is one unifying piece that kind of brings you all together. And we'll touch on that a little bit later, okay? So if we know that personality is ultimately defined as all of the things that make you who you are, your beliefs, your attitudes, your opinions, your thought processes, all of those things. According to Sigmund Freud then, he saw an awful lot of patients that were suffering from some pretty significant nervous disorders. You would know them now as anxiety disorders. And their complaints just couldn't really seem to be explained in terms of logical thought processing or physical causes. He called this hysteria and said that there had to be some kind of reason behind why these people were experiencing what they were, and that it had to be a psychological explanation, okay, something happening up here in the mind. So from this, he is the first guy to attempt to comprehensively look at personality. And he's also one of the first to try to study mental disorders too, or at least come up with a theory behind why people have mental disorders. His views are going to be kind of controversial and very weird, and it's going to be kind of awkward for me to explain some of these things to you, but we're going to do our best to get through them, and then obviously we'll do some in-class activities to kind of help you better get an understanding of what Freud believed. So for Freud, everything stems back to the significance of what he called the unconscious mind. It is this reservoir or storehouse of predominantly unacceptable thoughts and feelings and memories and behaviors. And so Freud, what he would do is he would ask people to ultimately participate in something called free association, where they would say whatever came to mind without attempting to censor or edit their thoughts in any way. And Freud believed this was a gateway into the unconscious, that if you did this, he could kind of interpret ultimately what was going on underneath the surface of the awareness, because to him, the most significant part of what made you who you were is the unconscious mind. So that process of free association through chain of thoughts, or even things like word association, where an individual will say a word and then you say whatever comes to mind. Once you were able to kind of bring up these painful or embarrassing unconscious memories, you could treat these and release them into the world, so to speak, so that way the patient would ultimately feel better. And that was the way that he felt one could treat that hysteria that he referenced and that we referenced earlier. Okay, so you have ultimately three key parts of the mind. If you took Intro to Psych with myself or any one of my colleagues, you know that this image is going to look awfully familiar to you because we shared it with you guys in Intro. If you think of the mind like an iceberg, with the largest chunk of it being kind of under the surface of the water, very similar to the structure of an iceberg, then this is going to all make a little bit more sense. So you have the conscious mind, which accounts for roughly 10% of the mind, and this is what you're currently aware of. So you're using your conscious mind right now as you sit here, as you listen to me talk, as you write down the words that I'm speaking to you. Right under the surface of the water, where things are kind of a little bit distorted in terms of reality, or a little murky, because if you think about how it used to be when you were young and you would kind of put your hand under the water in the pool or in the bathtub, and you would see how your hand would look a little bit distorted in terms of its size or its shape under the water, and then when you would pull it out to see reality, it was a little bit different. That's the preconscious. Your preconscious is info that's not fully in your conscious level of awareness, but it's retrievable as it's needed. So Freud believed that this was, for example, where more conscious memories are stored. Things, like me signaling to you at this present moment, asking you to think about when you learned how to ride a bike. Okay, that was not consciously in your full level of awareness until I prompted it out of your preconscious storage there just a second ago. Okay, so that was what he kind of referenced as preconscious, this area that's not fully aware, but it's possible to be pulled up. And then you have the unconscious, which is full of these sexual and aggressive urges. That's what S&A stands for, is sex and aggression, that hide under the surface of your awareness, that guide your behavior in any number of ways that you are not fully conscious of. And they're in oftentimes opposition to what society deems to be moral or acceptable. So, where do you see these unconscious influences then? Well, you can take a look at them in terms of the latent content of dreams. We discussed this in Unit 5 to an extent. You have the symbolic meaning of the dream, which is the latent imagery, and then you have the manifest imagery, which is the actual imagery itself of a dream. So if you have this dream that your sister is a purple hippo charging down the hallways of the school, and the school is your house, then the manifest content of that is those actual images. But then the symbolic meaning is what is inside your unconscious at that time. It's your brain's, your unconscious way of saying, trying to bring that stuff to the surface of your awareness. So maybe what the symbolic meaning of your dream is that your sister being presented as a purple hippo, that's something that's going to be pretty obvious and pretty noticeable. You're not just going to pretend that it doesn't exist, or even act as if you see it, that it's not something that really stands out to you as being really noticeable. Perhaps that's symbolic of you feeling as if you are constantly compared to your sister by people in your lives. You feel like your sister always gets a ton of attention, you get overlooked. So Freud believed that you could tap into your unconscious through the symbolic meaning of your dreams. Some other ways that you could tap into the unconscious are with things like Freudian slips. These are slips of the tongue that are sexual and aggressive in nature that Freud believed were our true unconscious thoughts attempting to surface at that point in time. So let's say, for example, intro kids, you'll remember this example I've given to you. You are trying to yell down for your friend down the hallway, and you try to yell out, "Hey, wait a sec!" But it comes out, "Yo, wait a sec!" A little awkward. You just yell that out in front of everybody. And so then everybody's going to be looking at you like, dude, what were you thinking about? Freud believed that those slips of the tongue were gateways into what was happening in our unconscious at that point in time. So how you develop then in terms of your personality, it all stems back to the unconscious. There are particularly important psychosexual stages that you go through as you grow and develop, and these happen in unconscious forces, okay? During these stages, you have a structure to your personality. You'll hear me talk about these, the id, the ego, and the superego. I'll talk about them in a second. But ultimately, it's during these stages that the id's pleasure-seeking energies, the id is your I want what I want when I want it component of your personality. It's that thing that operates on immediate gratification. Its pleasure-seeking energies are focused on one particular sensitive area of the body called an erogenous zone. These areas, or these energies, are demonstrated in something called the libido. And that libido is going to be focused on that pleasure-seeking area. And ultimately, if one resolves through their psychosexual stages of development normally, then all is right with the world, no issues. But if you end up experiencing what we call fixation, which you'll hear me reference in a little while, that means you were stunted in that stage of your psychosexual development. That means that that libido, that sexual energy that you were supposed to resolve, will be preoccupied with the erogenous zone that was the focal point of that stage. Yeah, that was a mouthful. Yeah, I'll explain it a little bit more in depth in a second. So let's talk about these psychosexual stages. The first one is the oral stage of psychosexual development. It happens when you are born, upwards of your first year of life. So Freud believed that you obtain pleasure from your mouth, ultimately by mouthing virtually everything that you could come in contact with, okay? Sucking on things, biting on things, swallowing. This was ultimately his way of attempting to explain why babies take the, the overwhelming preoccupation of just taking anything they can get their hands on and shoving it in their mouth. Why babies like binkies, why babies like bottles, all of those kinds of things. Why the first response any really little child has is to take something and just shove it immediately into their mouth, okay? So he believed that this was a psychosexual stage, that you had some libido at that time frame of your life. It was preoccupied with the mouth. And so ultimately, if you did not resolve the energy in this stage when you grew, you will develop a fixation in certain behaviors, and we'll get into those in a little bit after we're done with these stages. Second stage of your psychosexual development is the anal stage. This occurs from roughly ages 1 to 3. This is when you obtained pleasure by learning how to control your bodily wastes. Yep, makes total sense, right? And it's not the slightest bit creepy at all. If you think about it from a logical sense, he's trying to explain why it is that little kids get, so excited and ultimately preoccupied with learning how to potty train. So, since it involved learning how to control your id's biological drives of going whenever you want it, this ultimately ended up being kind of the stage with which he focused on as an area of libido when you are young. Okay, this is another stage where if you get fixated in it, you can end up having some lasting implications for your personality development later on. We'll get to. The third stage is considered to be the phallic stage. Okay, this is from ages 3 to 5. Freud believed this was absolutely the most crucial and critical to your development. This is when you become curious about your genitalia and you deal with, of all things, the incestuous feelings that you have toward your opposite sex parent. He referenced this as the Oedipus complex. So let's do a little background to understand why it's called the Oedipus complex. If you're familiar with Greek mythology, you are familiar with Oedipus and his Odyssey. He went out on a quest, as most Greek males often did back in the day, to demonstrate their physical specimenship. Oedipus was the result of a tryst between a Greek god and a human mother. Oedipus was given up and just kind of left there to fend by himself. He was adopted into a family, but he didn't know that he was adopted. And so when he went out to a neighboring kingdom, he fell in love with the queen, and she with him. Problem was, queen was obviously married to the king, so they devised a plan for him to remove the king from the situation by disposing of him. Then after they were married, turns out Oedipus married his mother. A little awkward. So that's where the Oedipus term comes from. So what is the Oedipus complex? Basically, it's you're a mama's boy. You have an unconscious desire for your mom and jealousy and hatred for your dad. Now, many students, when we make reference to this in class, their initial response is, oh my God, no, I don't feel that. I don't hate my dad. Like, I don't have that going on. Here's the problem, and I definitely don't have that toward my mother. It's happening in your unconscious, so you don't know that this is in fact how you feel. This is why, he would argue, Freud, that you are a mama's boy. You have incestuous feelings towards the opposite sex parent. Now, not to be left out, ladies, you have the Electra complex. That is ultimately why you are a daddy's girl. This was added later on by a Neo-Freudian named Kieran Horney, and then ultimately Sigmund Freud's daughter Anna, who was very heavily influenced by the work her father did. So this is the female version. Now, in the Oedipus complex, gentlemen, if you are fixated in this stage, you fear castration. Ultimately, that is the culminating punishment that you are afraid of if your dad finds out about the incestuous feelings that you have for your mother. Ladies, ultimately, there was an aspect here in terms of the Electra complex, that there's a little bit of an aspect of penis envy, that ultimately you subconsciously wish you had some qualities of a male, and so ultimately that is why you have the relationship toward your father that you do. Now, the big question becomes then, what do you deal with in terms of kids who don't have that going on? They're not mama's boys or daddy's girls. They are, for example, boys who connect more with dad, or girls who connect more with mom. What's the deal? Ultimately, what Freud would take a look at and say is that you have operated on identification here, okay? To cope with those incredibly threatening and very inappropriate incestuous feelings that you have toward your opposite sex parent, what you do is you repress them. You push them to the back of your mind, and then what you do is you identify with the rival parent, okay? So basically, you operate under the mentality of, if you can't beat them, join them sentiment. So this is why you see little children in the ages of 3 to 5 acting like dad. So you see in this picture here, this little boy is trying to imitate dad in terms of using tools and being like dad, and ultimately attempting to identify with his dad. This is why you see, for example, girls that try to dress up like mom or wear makeup like mom or act like mom. This is what Freud believed was happening there in your unconscious to explain that behavior. Okay? It is through this process of identification that you begin to develop your superego, which you'll learn about in a little bit, which is your morality compass. Okay? It's your idea of right versus wrong, good versus bad. It's very heavily impacted by what society says is acceptable or not acceptable. Okay? So your superego gains a lot of strength in this stage because you start to incorporate an awful lot of your parents' values into what you perceive as being okay and not okay. The last two stages you are presented with in your stages of development are the latent stage. You just got done hearing me use that term latent with you. Latent means hidden. Okay, so in this stage, you suppress sexual interest. So this is kind of the complete opposite of the phallic stage, where you're very, curious about your genitalia and obviously driven by incestuous feelings that you have toward the opposite sex parent. In the latent stage, once you hit kind of roughly 5 years old, you flip that around. You play mostly with same-sex peers. For all intents and purposes, this is the cooties stage. Okay, the opposite sex has cooties. This is when you see little boys whose moms attempt to kiss them on the cheek, and their response is like, "Mom, that's gross." Okay. Ultimately, that was kind of how Freud attempted to explain that kind of behavior. In the final stage, you've got the genital stage. Be careful. Do not confuse this with phallic stage. A lot of times, because what students know about the phallic stage being that children are preoccupied with their genitalia, they have the tendency to kind of confuse the names of these stages and assume that the genital stage is that third stage in their psychosexual development. In actuality, the genital stage is adult sexuality. It happens at the age of 12 on up, okay? This is ultimately when you express sexual feelings towards others. This is when you start to see the advent of relationships that are romantic. And so ultimately that was his explanation for this stage. Now, here's the kicker. If you were fixated in any one of the earlier stages of your psychosexual development, Freud believed you would not have energy for the genital stage, and so therefore what would happen is you would have a very unsatisfying love life. This was his way of attempting to explain why it is that you found people who would never fully commit in relationships, who would cheat in relationships, and anything along those lines. So then when you come back to this whole issue of the concept of fixation that you've heard me make reference to a couple of times now, when, if there is a traumatic event that occurs while you were in those psychosexual stages, your libido is going to end up being stuck in that particular stage. We can come back to the aspects of oral fixation or anal fixation. So if you are stuck in the oral stage of your psychosexual development, you are going to, for all intents and purposes, excessively seek out oral contact, whether it be by picking up certain habits like smoking, drinking, binge eating. That's what he would take a look at there. He would also look at aspects of your personality in terms of components that you have behaviorally speaking, like dependence, being insanely clingy with others, or not being able to have a sense of independence for yourself. You're just incredibly passive. Or he said you could go the opposite end of things, which is biting sarcasm or to act tough. Now, if you are sitting there saying to yourselves, "Lady, you are the queen of sarcasm in class," you are absolutely true. So, for all intents and purposes, here I am acknowledging to you in the YouTube world that I am, according to Freud, stunted in my oral stage of my psychosexual development. According to him, that's the only thing that would explain why it is that I make the kind of sarcastic, snotty comments to you that I do. Now, if you were stunted in the anal stage of your psychosexual development, you are going to demonstrate those behaviors at one of two poles with regard to your level of organization in particular. Okay, so if you are anal retentive, many of you guys have probably heard that term before. You're very controlling, very orderly. Everything has its proper place. Everything is just so in your life. You are the person who, when you saw my calendar and the expectations I had with regard to your binders in that organization, were like, "Oh my God, this is amazing!" You would be our anal retentive individuals. Now, if you are anal expulsive at the other end, which is probably one of my favorite terms from psychology of all time, you are messy, you are disorganized. It truly looks as if your level of organization is that a bomb blew up inside of your book bag. And when you came into my classroom, your response to seeing how uptight and orderly I am with regard to organization was, oh, sweet Lord, I am in some serious trouble. You are what we would call that anal expulsive individual. All right, so let's move on from some of this really entertaining terminology, and let's talk about the structures of your personality, okay? So you've got the id, you've got the ego, and you got the superego. So you heard me make reference to the id, you also heard me make reference to the superego, so hopefully these won't be too difficult for you to follow, especially when you hear just kind of how they've been portrayed in some aspects of pop culture. So the id, like you heard me say earlier, is your I want what I want when I want it drive, okay? It's there to satisfy our basic desires, okay? And it goes on the pleasure principle in the sense of you're going to attempt to attain whatever you want when you want it, rather than delaying gratification, so to speak. At the opposite end of the spectrum, you've got the superego, which operates on the moral principle because it is your standard for judgment of conscience, right versus wrong, good versus bad, okay? It's kind of the push for you for your future aspirations. So if you look at it in the sense that the id is kind of like the little devil on your shoulder, a lot of it's been presented that way in cartoons, for example. And if you think of it that the superego is the little angel on your shoulder on the opposite end, you can kind of see that here, right there. There's our devil, there's our angel. That makes it a little bit easier for kids to be able to differentiate between the id and the superego. Now, in the middle of these pieces is the ego. Okay, your ego operates on the reality principle. It's the compromiser between the expectations and demands of the id, the I want what I want when I want it, and the constraints of the superego. Okay, because a lot of times what our superego is going to tell us is to delay our gratification, right? And so there's this interplay of what the id wants and what the superego wants, and in many respects they are very much not intertwined. They go in opposition of one another. So it's the ego's job to ultimately act as the kind of the executive or the decision maker to mediate between what the demands of the id and the superego happen to be. It's going to try to make both sides happy. And so what it does then in those circumstances a lot of times is it experiences anxiety and conflict. It's no different than you who get stuck between two friends that are fighting. A lot of times your response to that situation when they're coming at you saying like, hey, pick sides, your response is like, dude, this is not my fight. Like, it's all you, okay? You're saying that because you want to avoid the anxiety of being placed in between those two friends and having to make a decision to side with one or the other, because you know that there's going to be some downside regardless of what choice you make. So what happens when the ego is presented with that anxiety is the creation of defense mechanisms, okay? What it tries to do is unconsciously, even though it is a partially conscious component of your personality, it will go to these scenarios here just kind of without us even thinking to do it. We don't consciously choose to do them sometimes. It will try to protect itself against that anxiety by creating these defense mechanisms. In and of themselves, they're not bad for you, okay? Freud didn't feel that way at all. He thought, though, that the only time that they became unhealthy is when they cause self-defeating behaviors, like laziness, a lack of accountability, for example, a lack of drive, or if they cause emotional problems, okay? So if, for example, that failing to kind of step up and do certain things can end up lending themselves toward the creation of, possible mental disorders. So let's take a look at each one of these guys and talk about them a little bit more in depth. Again, if you took Intro to Psych, this is going to sound so similar to what you did with either myself or any of the other Intro to Psych teachers here in the building, because we tackle quite a few of these in Intro as well. So we're going to kind of stick with some of the similar examples to things because a lot of times those did a really good job of helping to connect for the students who took it. And then obviously if you didn't take Intro, this is going to be nice because it's going to put you on a pretty level playing field with the Intro crew. So let's talk about each of these individual defense mechanisms. First, you have repression. This, for Freud, underlies all other defense mechanisms because ultimately what we're attempting to do is avoid the painful thoughts that come with some of the actions of trying to give in to our id's demands and our superego's constraints. So, for repression specifically, anytime we're attempting to avoid painful thoughts by just pushing them to the back of our mind, you can see this in circumstances of witnesses in crimes. Okay, they don't always remember every single detail because what they witnessed was so traumatic and so painful that a lot of times those details could be, kind of pushed to the back of their minds. I liken repression in many ways to try to, get it across to my students as very similar in regards to procrastination. If you think about how you guys typically study for tests, and how I've called you out on the carpet on that numerous occasions. You wait until the very last minute. Why? Because you don't want to have to think about the fact that you've got that thing that you need to study for. It's a painful thought for you. So what do? You just push it to the back of your mind and you say, oh, I'll just do it. I'll study later. I'll study the day before the test. I'll be fine. So I would liken repression to being very similar to procrastination in that kind of regard. But repression can happen with any kind of painful circumstance. It can be refusing to acknowledge certain traumas that happened in your childhood, like any kind of abuse. That's another very common one. Regression. This is when you, as a semi-adult, basically go back to acting not like an adult because you don't want to have to deal with adult responsibility, okay? A lot of times you throw temper tantrums when you don't get your way. I guarantee if I have any parents that are sitting in the background of this, they're probably smiling as they listen because they're thinking of any number of different ways with which you have attempted to regress and do these things in your everyday life relatively recently, okay? So you can't tell me that there haven't been circumstances at some point in your high school career where you didn't stomp up the stairs and slam your door and act like a little kid throwing a temper tantrum because you didn't get your way for something. I have lots of students that throw temper tantrums with me in class at the beginning of this course when I don't give you guys stamps for a reading guide section because you skipped a question or two. And they don't respond very well to that. There's often a lot of stomping back to our desks and sulking and an awful lot of that I get thrown my way too. Displacement is the third defense mechanism you want to familiarize yourself with. This is when we take either sexual or aggressive impulses and we take them out on and place them off on something that is more acceptable, okay? So, for example, you are really, 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 really peeved at your mother, okay? And you're fighting every urge that you have to take out that aggression physically on your mother. So instead, what do? Maybe you take it out on the family dog. You yell at the dog. You push it away, for example, when it tries to come up to you and get you to play with a toy with them. You're really angry at something that just went down here in the hallways. So what's your response? Take your locker door and slam it as hard as you possibly can. Okay, you're displacing that anger and taking it, venting it, if you will, onto something that is typically non-threatening. That's the big component for displacement that kind of separates it out from some of these other defense mechanisms that sound really similar, like projection. Okay, with the displacement component, you're taking those unacceptable urges and you're trying to you tend to take them out on something that is non-threatening, okay? So, anger at your sibling for playing their music really loud after you've yelled at them 4 or 5 different times, so your response is to take your pillow and just, throw it around, punch it, do whatever you can. Well, your pillow can't fight back, right? So it's a very defenseless or non-threatening piece there. For projection, this is when you disguise threatening impulses that you have or threatening feelings you have by attributing them to other people, okay? So if you think about how a projector works, its entire job is to take an original image and place it off onto something else, right? So it makes sense that projection then is when you take your impulses and place them off onto someone else instead. So you want to end things with your significant other, but you feel bad and you don't want to be the dumper. So what do? You start picking fights with the other person and accusing them of being the one that wants to end things, so you guys just need to break up for that sake. Okay, and so you are placing your feelings off onto the other individual. Sublimation. This is one that kids kind of struggle a little bit on, so I'm going to spend a bit more time focusing on this than maybe, say, some of the others that I've gone through pretty quickly so far. Sublimation is when we take our energy, unconsciously so, and what we're trying to do is we divert those feelings, those urges that we have, into something that is considered to be socially acceptable, because we want to avoid the undesirable activities that could occur because of that, okay? So let's say, for example, you like to hit things. If you've got a lot of anger and pent-up aggression going on there under the surface of your awareness, okay? So what happened was, when you were younger then, what your parents did was they took all that energy they knew that you had, and they got you into boxing or mixed martial arts or jiu-jitsu or, I don't know, ultimate fighting, UCF or UFC or whatever the heck it is. And so in those circumstances, you took those, because it's not socially acceptable for you to just walk around punching people. It's just not. No matter how many of you guys like to try to do that in the halls and start fights. So in those circumstances, you're taking something socially unacceptable and you're channeling it into something that is pro-social or socially okay. I once had a group of intro students who did an activity where they had to act these guys out, and so they had to create examples of sublimation. And so they had this scenario of a gentleman, an older guy who had this unconscious desire to like cut things with knives and stuff. So he channeled that into becoming a butcher, because there it's socially acceptable for you to take a knife and just hack up meat till the cows come home, pun intended, because ultimately it's okay for a butcher to take very large meats and hack those chunks up to end up preparing them for people. So that's kind of another one. Sublimation is one that's a little bit more difficult for kids to find connections to, so we're going to talk about that one a little bit more in class. Reaction formation is not the same in sublimation as sublimation, simply just because reaction formation is when we feel one way, we present the opposite. A lot of times it's unacceptable impulses that we present in an opposite acceptable form, but it isn't always that stuff, right? So let's say, for example, you really dislike your psychology teacher. She assigns way too much work. The class is way too hard, way harder than it actually ever needs to be. And she thinks she's funny and she's really not. But you end up telling everybody how much you actually love her and you think she is so funny and oh my gosh, you're learning about this stuff all the time and you're thinking about becoming a major in psychology. You're presenting the opposite of those feelings that you demonstrate. Teen girls are notorious for doing a reaction formation style, especially when you try to talk to them, whether they be friend or significant other, right? And it's pretty obvious from their behavior that something is a little off and they're not happy. But then, you try to ask them about it and their response is, I'm fine. They're not really fine, but they don't want to, end up like spouting out whatever is going to be coming out, because it could lead to some unacceptable stuff like fights or conflict or confrontation. So they just sit there and they say, no, I'm fine. So that's that one. Rationalization is when we try to create logical explanations for our behaviors to justify them. Everybody does this. Even I do this. I'll tell you guys this sometimes too, when I'll say like, oh, I forgot to, do that, this activity where I changed the calendar. I forgot to make that adjustment because I had Eliza and she was, up 8 times last night and my brain is just fried and I didn't even think about it. We all try to justify our actions and make logical explanations for what we do, especially when it involves circumstances where we don't step up and do the stuff that we were supposed to do in the first place, right? So, you really want to go to the movies with your friends, and so you justify going to see that movie instead of studying for a test or doing your homework for this class, for example, by just saying, well, I'm going to fail it anyway, or, oh, it's just one homework assignment. She gives us so much stuff that it doesn't really matter if I just get one stamp missing, right? So you're trying to justify what you're doing to make yourself feel better. Denial is when we refuse to accept the reality in front of us. So if you want to look at this in a sense of, going back to the whole circumstance from Unit 7 of looking at belief bias and belief perseverance, in many respects it involves an aspect of denial. We just won't acknowledge what's in front of us, okay? So, knowing full well that your significant other is really not treating you the way that they used to, and they're kind of very distant and standoffish and stuff like that. Awful lot of circumstances happen, especially with teenagers, that they try to just, brush it off and say like, oh, nothing's wrong, they're just really busy. When in actuality, more than likely, they're over the relationship, because if it was a priority to them, they would make it a priority, right? An example here, you get a rejection letter from a college that you really wanted to go to, but you just go around telling everybody like, yep, I'm in. I'm going to start looking into the honors dorms, and I'm going to be taking a look at all this stuff to go to Ohio State. Go Bucks. Okay. So real fast, because I know that this is a longer video for you guys. I promise all the rest of them are not this long, but Freud and psychoanalysis is a very in-depth assessment of things for personality. Let's talk Neo-Freudians. There are 3 Neo-Freudians you need to familiarize yourself with. Why are they called Neo-Freudians? Best way to take a look at them is these are the psychodynamicists. You've heard me use that term interchangeably with psychoanalytic. or psychodynamic perspective. Okay, so Freud is the first guy. He created psychoanalysis. Neo-Freudians are what we consider to be psychodynamic in the sense that they take some of what Freud believed, but they put different slants on things. Okay, so if we look at guys like Adler, Alfred Adler, his big focus was on childhood tension, just like it was with Freud and those psychosexual stages. But for Adler, he adjusted things to be more social in terms of significance, not sexual, which kind of makes a little bit more sense because it just seems kind of weird to think about a 3-year-old focusing on sexual components of things. So for Adler, as one of the Neo-Freudians, his big focus was the concept of inferiority. He believed that all children struggle with an inferiority complex during their growth. And so what they're trying to do is strive for superiority and power, and that's why they do so much of what they do. And it, you know, if you think about it, it makes an awful lot of sense. Many of us are siblings, right? How many times have you felt, whether real or perceived, that you're compared to another sibling? How many times do you guys try to compare yourself to your peers in this class? Students who sit right next to you who seem to just ace these tests left and right, and there you are barely being able to pull a 50, right? So inferiority complex is the name of the game for Alfred Adler. For Karen Horney, as you heard me make reference to her earlier, she believed in the social component to development, and her big thing was that children are attempting to try to overcome a sense of helplessness, okay, and that basic trust, that term that we learned about in Unit 9 is going to come back again in here. Basic trust is a very critical component to that, okay? Children feel this sense of helplessness in their environment, that they're born into this very crazy, chaotic world, right, that they just don't understand. And so one of the things that children often end up having to take a look at is overcoming that sense of helplessness, of feeling that there is trust in their environment and trust in their world. And the more that they can end up predicting based off of that makes them feel more stable and well-adjusted and therefore capable of achieving success. It's also important to note that Karen Horney kind of comes out in opposition to some of Freud's assessments of women, that they have weak superegos, for example, you know, so they don't have very strong morals or capabilities of conscience-wise reasoning in that regard, and also that they suffer from penis envy, that, you know, women want to be, for all intents and purposes, more like men. And then you get Carl Jung. Jung's whole theory of the collective unconscious is fascinating. His argument is that you have an individual unconscious, just like Freud emphasized, but you also have what we call the collective unconscious, which is this experienced reservoir of memories and feelings and emotions and all of that all humans experience because they're human, okay? So, you know, we are certainly individuals who have all gone through very individualized experiences in our lives to make us who we are, but at the same time, he argues we have this collective unconscious that unites us as human beings just because we're human beings. Demonstrations of things that we can all understand because we are human. Those demonstrations are presented in things called archetypes, okay? So symbolic images of universality that anyone can understand regardless of culture or myth that's presented and how it's presented, okay? Art, stories, things like that. So if I were to show you an image of Darth Vader, for example, even if many of you guys have never even seen anything to do with Star Wars, you've never seen any of the movies straight through or anything like that, most people know that Darth Vader is a symbol of evil. He's the bad guy, so to speak, right? And that when presented with scenarios of superheroes, for example, like Superman or Batman, they are the hero, okay? They symbolize what it means to be a hero. They embody those behaviors. And we'll do a couple of activities in class with one another to kind of help bring all of that together for you too. So let's talk about how we can wrap all of this stuff up with how you assess these unconscious processes. How do you, if the whole goal of trying to understand personality is to provide persons with a means of measuring it, how do you assess all of these creepy sexual and aggressive urges that are hiding underneath the surface? Well, from a psychoanalytic or psychodynamic perspective, you look at it through projective tests, okay? When presented with ambiguous stimuli, a therapist will ultimately end up interpreting what your answers mean, that they're then going to be a gateway into your unconscious and a means of pulling those pieces up for you. So, two main projective tests that are used are the thematic apperception test, which is the TAT, or the Rorschach Inkblot. So the TAT was developed first by Henry Murray, and then there will be some other elaborations that come along with it. But he used this test where you given, for all intents and purposes, an ambiguous image, and you have to express your inner feelings and interests through the stories that you make up about the ambiguous scene, okay? So ultimately, we could tap in, if we are psychoanalysts, to your unconscious based off of how you interpret the image that occurs here. So you've got this one there, you have some of these images here, so you would write stories, and then I, as a psychoanalyst, would be able to interpret what's going on in your unconscious in terms of conflicts and certain motivations based off of what the story was that you shared with me, okay? Here's some more. We'll do a little bit of these in class. It's kind of fun to have kids share some of their stuff. The Rorschach Inkblot, on the other hand, is when you are presented with an ambiguous image, and then ultimately what you have to do is interpret what you see there. And then, again, based off of this, what Hermann Rorschach created was a set of 10 inkblots, and then based off of every answer that you gave to those inkblots and interpretations you gave, then it was the job of the therapist to interpret what was being presented there and then tell you what was going on in your unconscious, okay? So, constructive criticism of all of this in general, not just with projective tests, but with Freud as well. Every theory we come across in personality is going to have some pros and some cons attached to it. And you're going to see me pretty much present all of the criticisms once we are done with each video. Here's the problem with projective tests. They are not reliable and they are not valid, okay? So there is no consistency of results. You might look at an inkblot and say, I think that looks like a skull, and I might take a look at it and say, I think it looks like a butterfly. So there's no consistency there in terms of the results. Validity is that it predicts what it's supposed to. Well, if the whole point behind these things is to be ambiguous and then interpret what your personal interpretation happens to be, there's no predictive value there in that regard, because you can't say, like, so I believe that that image right there is always going to result in a skull that is being interpreted here. Okay, so there is no reliability, there is no validity to these tests. Even trained raters will evaluate the same patient, come up with different interpretations of those things. And so it's very common and possible for projective tests to misdiagnose someone as normal as in fact being pathological and having an awful lot of deep-seated, deep-rooted psychological issues that, you know, can lead to disordered behavior later on. Okay? So, the ultimate reality behind all of this is it's not scientifically proven. It's not possible for you to have any means of using scientific method to assess any of the psychoanalytic perspectives, whether they be Freud, whether they be psychodynamic with Jung or anything along those lines. So this is probably one of the least popular theories behind personality because of that lack of scientific capacity for checking the reliability and the validity of the findings. So this is the end of your first video note set on personality. Obviously, as I've said, we'll do some activities in class with one another to kind of help bring this stuff to life for you, but as is always the case, if you don't have the clarification that you need coming through on this, just come let me know.